Okay, so the topic today, guys, is the Weimar Republic, from Weimar Republic to Nazi Reich, which is several lectures. We're going to cover the development of Germany after World War One. So the starting point is the end of the war in November 1918, and then we will finish by Hitler in power, a survey of what Germany was like under the Nazi rule. So the starting point is the lost war and the German Revolution. Now, November 1918, as we discussed before, is when armistice begins, when the Allies and the Germans stop firing at each other, and there will be long, protracted negotiations for peace. We talked about this as Versailles Peace Treaty, which resulted in big territorial losses for Germany. Germany would lose Alsace-Lorraine, it would lose Danzig, it would lose a piece of land to Czechoslovakia and a piece of land to Holland. And as we discussed before, the most damaging part was a clause that would name Germany as the guilty party in starting World War One, which is not exactly right because it was pretty much Serbia and Austria that started the war. But nevertheless, and the final blow was the fact that it was not even invited to the Versailles negotiations and that it had to pay a huge indemnity, something like 130 billion Reichsmarks, something like $38 billion in those days. But this is the side story. This is the external situation that would develop in the spring of 1919. Now, our purpose is to look at what Germany was like as a country, as a society, in November 1918. Now, basically, there's three groups of people. There are monarchists, there's those that still believe in the Kaiser. They are kind of like an equivalent to those that were called the Whites in Russia. They are conservative, they're military, they're resentful of the lost war. They still support the Kaiser, and they resent the fact that the Allies forced him out. That, as you recall, the condition was put by the Allies that the Kaiser had to go, that they will not negotiate peace with the Kaiser. So in a sense, removal of Kaiser, is very important to understand, is not a product of domestic uprising, as it was in Russia, for example. It was the fact that the Allies made very clear to the German ruling elite that they were not going to negotiate with the Kaiser. He had to go. It was one of the conditions to stopping the war. Now, that, of course, caused a lot of resentment, especially in the right or conservative part of society, and it would show itself off, as we shall see. Now, in the middle were the liberals. They used to be called national liberals. They're also quite resentful, but they are realists, and they understand that you kind of have to move on, and the only way to get a decent deal from the Allies is to cooperate. And then in the left, you have a huge social democratic party that will actually run the government for most of the times in the republic that's going to be formed. This SPD, the Social Democratic Party, we talked a lot about it. As we recall, it had the largest number of seats in the parliament, in the Reichstag, before World War One. And of course, after World War One, they were the clear winner. And again, parallels with Russia, the SR party, the Socialist Revolutionary Party, same thing in Russia. They had absolute majority, and they were the largest party in the Constituent Assembly. So its equivalent would be the SPD, Social Democratic Party of Germany, that had the largest number of seats in the Constituent Assembly in Germany. Now, the difference between Russia and Germany was that in Germany, the SPD stayed in power. They won the Constituent Assembly, and they stayed. In Russia, the Social Revolutionary Party, they won the Constituent Assembly, but they did not stay because they were overthrown by the Bolsheviks, by the communists. So you have this, conflict between the communists and the socialists that is going to play out in every country. That's why it's so important. Russian Revolution began a process of new politics where you have a new guy on the block that's called the communists. that would appear almost everywhere in Europe and would try to act politically in terms of getting power. And this was going to be also the case in Germany, and very, very quickly. So the so-called German Revolution, and I say so-called because it was not really a revolution, it was a removal of the Kaiser, happened in November 1918. But already in December 1918, you have the first uprising that would, they're not communists yet, but they will become later on communists. At this point, they're called Spartakist group, coming from the name Spartacus, who is a slave leader in the Roman times of the Roman Republic. So Spartakist group, they are called a group because they have not yet formed a communist party. But out of this group will emerge what is called KPD, Communist Party of Germany. Kommunistische Partei Deutschlands. This is why it's in KPD. The abbreviation is in German. Now, at this moment, they are the left wing of the Social Democratic Party. To be more precise, they had already split, and there was a independent Social Democratic Party, which was a left wing. And out of the independent Social Democratic Party, you have a Spartakist group that would develop later on into the KPD, Communist Party of Germany. Now, this uprising is very important as an indication of, as I said, what's coming up in Europe. There's no more just the left-wing socialists. Among the socialists, you have the rise of the communists. What do the communists want? Very, very easy. From now on, the communists all over Europe for the next 70 years would want to be like Russia. In France, they would call it Soviets partout. In Germany, they would call it Arbeitersräte, which means councils. It's the kind of a new movement in Europe to create workers' councils that would be, like in Russia, representatives of workers and soldiers. And this is what they actually try to do in Germany in this uprising in Munich, in Bavaria. And they are relatively successful. They do hold on to power for a couple of weeks, and it's called the Sowjetische Republik Bayern, which means Soviet Republic of Bavaria. So, Bavarian Soviet Republic is proclaimed, and it is in Munich, and for about 2 or 3 weeks they hold on to power, and that really scares out of their mind the elites of Germany, because it looks like there's going to be a repeat of what happened in Russia. Soviet republics are going to be workers' councils, Communist Party. It's a nightmare that begins to haunt. It seems like Marxist prophecies is beginning to come true. The specter of communism is wandering all over Europe. They are absolutely terrified by the prospect of a communist revolution. So, to suppress this uprising, which is led, by the way, by 2 important persons that you have to remember, their names is one of Rosa Luxemburg. She's Jewish, she's socialist, she's of Polish, Russian descent, and the other is Karl Liebknecht. So these are the 2 leaders, Karl Liebknecht. The 2 leaders of the Spartakist group that were the founders of the German Communist Party. So Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, to counter their action, there's a very important organization that is formed that's called Freikorps, which means Free Corps, which means volunteer organizations of soldiers. Very similar to Russia, where they formed the volunteer army of the officers who were led by General Denikin. In Germany, they are volunteer detachments of veterans. That's the key point. Volunteer detachments of veterans, which means soldiers who used to be in World War I trenches, who are tough, who are very patriotic, and really detest the communists. So these Freikorps are organized into a striking force, and they hit hard against the Spartakist groups, the leftists, and they basically destroy them. And Rosa Luxemburg uh, and Karl Liebknecht, they're seized and they're murdered immediately in January 1919. So basically, this whole episode shows that there's not going to be a communist revolution in Germany. It's suppressed